This is like standing backstage and the curtain is down and you're waiting for it to rise. While we're waiting, should somebody have an internet outage, we'll simply keep progressing and jump back in as you're able to. And we're on. All right, the room is now open. Thank you for joining us today. We're just going to give a few moments for the room to fill up and allow people to enter. While that's happening, I will go over a few things. First, we are recording this today. It will be available on demand afterwards at YouTube and Facebook. You'll see those addresses right over here. There is a chat. If you look down at the bottom of the screen and you hover your mouse, you will see a chat button. If you have questions for our panelists, please feel free to type them out there. Send those to everybody, and we will be addressing those later on. We've still got a few seats down here in the front. If anybody wants to come on down. Yeah, no, not really. Without further ado, I'd like to officially welcome you to the SEEP Network latest webinar on crisis communications before, during, and after. My name is Stephen Haal. I'm the Director of Communications at St. Michael and All Angels Episcopal Church in Dallas, Texas. And I'm currently on the road in sunny Florida in my palatial Marriott hotel room. If for some reason the Wi-Fi drops out, please have fun with everybody else and I'll jump back in. As we jump into this today, I'm so excited that you've taken time to join with us. This is an amazing time. It seems to me that COVID-19 has illustrated well for each of us the things that we may or may not be comfortable with in our knowledge about how to communicate during times of crisis. The purpose of today is literally to create a templated type of roadmap, what you do before, what you do during, what you do afterwards. And our panel today, the Rockstar panel, has been kind of divvied up, and they're going to usher you through those, and we'll have time for Q&A at the back end. Without further ado, I'd like to give the panelists just a short few moments to introduce themselves. And I'm actually going to start with my right, this way, with Nancy Davidge. Nancy, tell us just a little bit about you and who you are and what you do.
Well, hello to everybody. I'm Nancy Davidge. I'm the Public Affairs Officer for the Episcopal Church. And as such, I work closely with Bishop Curry and the leadership team on messaging to the entire church. Probably many of you receive far too much email from my office. But I'm glad to be here with everyone and looking forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say as well as your questions.
Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Bartenstein, and I am the Communications Director at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Richmond, Virginia. I have also served on the staff of the Diocese of Virginia as Communications Director for 12 years, and at Virginia Public Media, the Central Virginia nonprofit corporation that owns and operates a number of PBS and NPR stations. And I have lived through and communicated during a lot of different crises. Churches breaking away from the Diocese of Virginia, to lawsuits, to theft, to cancer, not my cancer, but leaders having cancer. So they're all, all kinds of crises that I've lived through, and looking forward to having a conversation with all these folks about best practices for doing that.
Ari.
My name is Ari Geller. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of West End Strategy Team. We're a strategic communications firm with offices in Washington, D.C. and New York, and we work primarily with nonprofit organizations. We do a significant amount of work broadly in the faith community, and among others within the faith community. One of the clients that I work very closely with is the Washington National Cathedral, who I've been working with, I think, since 2011 now. So seen them through a number of crises, including the earthquake in 2011, which was one of the first things I worked with them on, and you know, helping navigate issues such as that with them. So very much looking forward to sharing some of the experience I have in this area with the rest of you.
Great. And last but not least, Larry.
Thanks, Steve. I'm Larry Ross in Dallas, Texas. I'm co-founder and CEO of A. Larry Ross Communications. We're a communications firm that operates at the intersection of faith and culture, providing crossover communications either out of the church into the mainstream or vice versa. And I started my career actually 43 years ago after getting out of college and with nonprofit, and then went to corporate PR, also agency PR in New York, where among other things, I handled the PR positioning for Joe DiMaggio, spokesperson for the Bowery Savings Bank. And then went from a sports icon to a faith icon in the early 80s. And for nearly 35 years was privileged to serve as personal media spokesperson for Dr. Billy Graham, the evangelist. And along the way, I've been involved with my colleagues in a number of crisis projects. Interestingly, most of them are exploding crises or somewhat evolving crises, but deal with the second reality of any emergency, which is what people think has happened. And yet, as we'll talk about in this seminar today, the COVID-19 crisis is indeed a crisis for the church, but it's a little different. You don't need necessarily get a war room and have to do messaging and media. It's about actually figuring out how to do ministry completely differently. Our world has completely changed, and so has the opportunity. But this crisis provides an opportunity for us as ministry. I hope we can unpack that a little bit today.
Fantastic. All right, without further ado, I'd like to kick this off with the preparation phase. How do you prepare for a moment of crisis in your communications? Ari Geller, start us off.
So I thought I would take a few minutes and just kind of walk everybody through, you know, first understanding what we mean by crisis, and then how to prepare for a crisis. And you know, that sounds weird to think about preparing for a crisis. You know, we all want to think that crises aren't going to happen, but you know, in the institutional world, you know, we always have to assume that that possibility is out there, and to make sure that we're prepared for it before we're in the middle of the crisis. And the first thing that you need to understand in understanding crisis communications is that first and foremost, a crisis is a business problem, not a communications problem. That you need to understand that there's a problem that's happening, and the solution to it isn't how to communicate yourself out of the problem. The solution is, what is the actual business solution to that problem, and then how do we communicate that business solution to our communities. But you know, despite what we see on TV, there is not this magic statement that we can suddenly write that solves whatever that crisis is. There's an actual practical solution that we need to understand. And as we're trying to figure out what that solution is, the other really important term to understand is trust. You know, that all the crisis communications is ultimately about either building trust or rebuilding trust with your community. And at its heart, trust is built by making good on lots of little promises that you make to your community. The more you make good on the promises that you make to your community, the more they see you fulfilling what you say you're going to do, the more that community is going to trust you, and it's going to allow you to navigate your way through a crisis. And when we talk about crisis, there's external crises that we think about, such as, you know, they come from the outside, you know, attacks on your mission, negative press about something that you're doing, you know, real or fake threats, you know, that can come up. You know, we work with the JCC Association North America. You may remember a few years ago that they had bomb threats were being called into JCCs all over the country. That was an external threat, you know, that they didn't have control over it coming, but it was a crisis. Natural disasters, you know, hurricanes, floods, a pandemic that we currently find ourselves in, all these external things that can have an impact on what we're doing and create a crisis. But then there's also internal crises that we think about, a difficult decision that we as an institution need to make that our community may not be happy with. There's the flip remark that a member of your clergy may make from the pulpit one week that suddenly gets picked up on social media, leaking of sensitive information, and then there's frankly the money and the sex scandals. All these are different types of crisis. I'm sure that many of you could name 10 more that I'm not even mentioning here along the way. And we have to understand that there are these different types of crises, that not all crises are the same, that they're ones that are predictable, and then they're the ones that we can't predict. They're the ones that we can prepare for, that we know that they're coming, and we can control the timing around them, and then they're the ones that we have no idea they're coming and they just land on our doorstep on any given day. And in all of our preparation, we have to be prepared to deal with both of those scenarios. And just to illustrate that a little bit, the two examples I often use is, so I live here in Washington, D.C. You may be familiar that there was a museum here in Washington called the Museum. Big museum, incredible. Unfortunately, it closed at the end of last year. But their closing, for them was a crisis, but it was one that they were able to manage. They knew that they were entering into this period where they were going to have to announce that they were closing. They were able to decide when they were going to make that news public. They were able to prepare everything in advance and dictate the way that crisis was communicated to their communities and to the public. So it was somewhat of a predictable crisis. Where on the other hand, you may have read the story about 2 years ago about the National Museum in Brazil burning down overnight. Obviously a huge crisis for that museum that they would have never predicted. Everybody left for work at the end of one day thinking they were going to come back to the museum the next day, and they show up to find out the entire museum had burned down, destroying a collection of art beyond value. There was no way that they could have known that was coming, but it was a crisis they found themselves in the middle of. So you can see that there's these, two, different kinds, the predictable and the unpredictable, and we have to be able to prepare for both. And ultimately, we as communicators working for these institutions, what we're trying to do is figure out how do we contain the crisis? How do we make sure that the crisis doesn't expand beyond where it's already reached, unless, of course, it's in some way helpful for us for that crisis to expand. But the whole idea is to contain it and then have control over how that information is shared, what people are hearing about it, and for you to maintain control of your narrative around the crisis, for you to be able to set the tone that people are understanding it through, rather than having somebody else externally kind of lay that narrative down and you playing catch up and trying to redefine it after it's already solidified in people's understandings.
Ari, a question for both you and Larry. With a lot of our people watching, some may be kind of one-stop shops. They may be thinking, how do I do all this? Are there things that are common to both the predictable and the unpredictable that right off the bat, you should be doing this to be ready for these moments? And is it just you? Do you need to put together a team?
Yes, very good. That's exactly where I was going to go next. Is the preparedness piece of this is that you don't wait for a crisis to start planning. That when the building is burning in the background, that's not the time that you call your first meeting of your crisis planning team. You want to have a team built and ready to go that already has procedures in place with people understanding what their defined roles are during a crisis, so that when the crisis hits, you're pulling that team together and getting them to work. And the really important thing to understand about pulling a crisis team together is understanding who the decision makers are, making sure that they're at the table, and on the flip side of that, not using it as an opportunity for people to feel included, frankly. That the crisis team is not the time to make every member of the staff feel like they have a voice at the table. It's the time when the decision makers need to be able to act quickly and nimbly, and that other people are kind of in a loop around that are rather than being decision makers, are more messengers, that they may have responsibility for delivering a decision, but they may not be involved in making the decision. Now, who's sitting at that table? There's going to be a couple of core people that are always going to be at that table: the head of your institution, probably your lay leader, as well as your professional leader, your communications person, and probably, if you have a security professional, that person. Now, beyond those roles, there may be some additional people depending on what the crisis is. That if it's something dealing with your fundraising, you're going to want the head of your development team sitting at that table. If you have a preschool and it's related to that, it may be your director of education. So, those people are going to change out depending on what the crisis is. But I know you asked Larry as well, so let me let you chime in on this question as well.
Thank you, Steve. I do think that whether it's predictable or unpredictable, there are several common elements. So, number one, I think you need to identify the concentric circles in an important public, starting with your board, your leadership, employees, and then on to donors or whatever. So the messaging for each is different. So it requires what we call a message action plan or a map. And I think the most important thing I would say is that in any type of a crisis, you want to self-identify rather than being pejoratively defined by others with an agenda. And you have to stay ahead of bad news. Bad news does not go away if it's ignored. It gets worse over time. So you want to release things rather than having to respond or react, if you will. And I think that part of it is just constantly adapting and evaluating. Public relations, we see it as a management function that speaks not only for leadership, but to leadership as well. So as you are messaging, and by the way, another important thing is to identify a spokesperson, either both primary and secondary. And depending on the nature of the crisis, it is often prudent to insulate the principal, the president, the CEO, whomever, and whether it's a board chair or communications chair as the taking point. And often you don't even want to do interviews because you get in the weeds fast. You communicate initially through prepared statements on a per inquiry basis. But these are all things that, and one other thing, I think it's important that you emphasize facts. Facts carry the day in any crisis. There's a lot of opinions and rumors flying around, and you want to be honest, obviously. As a church, you're not going to lie anyway, or misrepresent. But crisis communications is not an above board Yale debate. It's sometimes a matter of, you can't make white, you can't make black white, but sometimes it's a matter of emphasizing the brightest shade of gray.
Okay, so Larry, we're going to transition into the during stage, and I'll let you kick off with that. But as you tie the two together, we're gonna come into what I'm gonna call my first adrenaline moment. Something is looming in the distance. You don't have facts, but you know that it's coming, and you're starting to get this feeling of, I need to be doing something. I need to be doing something, but you actually don't know what to do yet. What do you do while you're waiting and bridging stage 1 into stage 2?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think in a situation like coronavirus, where everything is so unknown, it's all fluid, we aren't in control of much, but one thing we can be in control of is our own decisions. And I think we have to be very deliberate and intentional about communicating and I think that it's important for communicators to be, as I said, straightforward and honest about their communications. But they also, we also need to, as Ari mentioned, the key word trust. At some point, we really may not be in crisis communications. We may be more of in a reputation management mode, if you will. And restoring trust is very critical, both for our members at a church, but also the community. And what I find fascinating is that as a result of coronavirus, we're seeing, according to some of the polls I've seen, church growth is up 300%. Some of the clients we represent, their online viewing is 3 times a typical Sunday while they're open in church. And so there's an unprecedented hunger and search for purpose and meaning. And so if I could just say a few things about crisis in the context of coronavirus. we now are entering week 8 of how my team and I have been sheltering in place, social distancing, working from home. And we've obviously been thrust into a crisis, but I think COVID has sparked a reawakening of the church in America, and for churches to reevaluate their systems and their strategies. And at normal times like these require a demand, if you will, strong leadership. And it's often looked at through the lens of communication and alignment between messaging and action. No doubt the coronavirus has crashed the system of the current church, but I brought to the forefront the need for change. But here's my question: what actually is the crisis? Is it we haven't been able to gather? Is it we're being labeled as non-essential? Is it having been caught flat-footed, some churches without a virtual online service? Uncertain future, lack of clarity how to re-engage when they reopen America. You know, there have been a lot of references to China in recent weeks, many pejorative. But one thing the Chinese language have that's very insightful, their word for crisis is made of 2 symbols, danger and opportunity. And I'd like to focus on the latter rather than the danger. We know what the dangers are. But in that regard, this could be the finest hour for the church as we come out of this crisis, to go forward with confidence, because we're not going to be returning to normal. We're going to be returning, the world's changed, we're going to return to better than normal from the standpoint of ministry. As we've just observed the first church, the first Easter in nearly 2,000 years, when the church was not able to gather in person. And yet, churches were empty, but the tomb is empty. And we know that Christ and not the coronavirus or COVID-19 still reigns with power over our faith and our health and even the economy. So,
Larry,
yeah.
If I can, I hear you saying that when a crisis arises, are all crises a moment to springboard into something better?
I would say there's a potential for that. If they aren't, we need to be looking for that silver lining and pivot. And I think it's the churches that have pivoted over the last 2 months that are not only surviving, they're thriving. And when I say pivot, I think we need to look at the world has changed. Initially, I saw a lot of churches messaging hope and encouragement, turning people from fear to faith. Now I see, if you watched the Pope online several weeks ago, he called people to repentance and to change our priorities and look at what's really important. And we are now all not going anywhere. We have an opportunity to hear the still small voice and help to interpret that for a hurting culture. I don't know if you saw Ross Douthat's op-ed in the New York Times last week, but he opined that there is a need for a story about what the pain and anguish of recent weeks meant. Meaningless suffering is the goal of the devil, but bringing meaning out of suffering is the saving work of God. And you know, we've been sheltered in place, but have many neighbors in need. Our love isn't sheltered in place, and we can take on a variety of forms. And I think that more and more, the American church, let's take the thing about how we've been called non-essential. The government is referring to they're focused on our safety. But in terms of the spiritual lives that we address, they're very essential. And so we have to redefine church, not as an event to attend or a place to go. We have to redefine church as a group of friends who love Jesus and share a common mission to serve others and to make disciples. And so I think what this crisis is going to do, you can't shut that down. This crisis is going to force churches to be missional, not marketing oriented. And we now have an opportunity to move from the mindset of going to church on Sunday to being the church 7 days a week. And I think the biggest mistake, let's say one other thing I unpack later, but the biggest mistake, Carrie Newhoff says that for church leaders to make in the next few months is when they go back into their buildings, they'll walk back into the past. They have to re-embrace a model of ministry designed to reach a world that no longer exists.
Excellent. Nancy, tell us your thoughts. How do we engage when the crisis hits?
So when the crisis hits, I think that's really when the work that Ari was talking about, and also Larry, really takes fruit, if you will. That when you have strong leaders who are trusted, that goes a long way towards what your next steps are in the crisis. And recently I was reading an article that named 4 leaders that they felt were among the most effective at this point in time. And they are Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who they really described her leadership as clear, consistent, and somehow simultaneously soothing. Angela Merkel was the second Prime Minister of Germany, and their description of her was her rationality, her consistency of style, but also her sentimentality. They mentioned Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, for his aggressive, swift response. And the fourth was London Breed, the mayor of San Francisco. And they talked about her courage in taking early action, even though that was controversial. And so in each of these areas, when we think about COVID-19, the spread, the response, where those states, where those countries are today, I think it's not surprising when you look at the leaders of that country. But what does that mean really for us, as the Episcopal Church? So we have many levels of leaders in our church, organized, as we all know, with bishops in dioceses, clergy and lay leaders as vestry in our churches. And so at each level, there's different groups responsible for the leadership, usually some combination of lay and ordained. And that's also true at the Episcopal Church, or Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society, our official name, that presiding Bishop Curry has his leadership team who he works with all the time. So they're a group that meets together regularly, knows each other, everyone has their roles. They do the ongoing preparation, and I expect that's similar in our diocese. But when you look at the leadership, I think, and again, I think Bob and Ari both mentioned some of these things in terms of, I think, first of all, truth. That when you trust your leader, you have a feeling that they are being truthful with you as they are able, and transparency goes hand in hand with that truth. Looking back on, some of my experiences over the years with crises, and many years ago when I was working in healthcare, one of the residents was missing, left the building, and was gone for quite a while. And you can imagine, clearly that's a crisis. Police are called in. And the police asked, or I asked the executive director, it was a rehab facility, has this person ever gone missing before? And they said no. And I was speaking with the sheriff, and the first thing the sheriff said to me was, oh yes, that's Mary. My officers all know her. She wanders away all the time. We bring her back and drop her at the front door. And so why I share that, and clearly we're not a residential facility, but it shows me that sometimes what we think we know is true may not be true. And so what I'm always counseling is to be cautious when it comes to certainty about things, and that you often may want to give yourself a little bit of an allowance. And I think, Larry, you mentioned about the PR role, the public affairs role, is messaging both to the leadership and then out to the world. And that's actually advice that I do give to Bishop Curry, something he just wrote quite recently. He wrote something down that I know he wanted to be true, and it might likely be true. but there was also evidence that it might not be true. And so we made that adjustment. So I think for those of you who are in communications roles, public affairs roles, is really looking for being careful when it comes to statements that are coming out, that you're not overstepping because you wish something were true.
If I can recap for just a minute, make sure that I'm hearing both of you correctly, I'm going to synopsize this a little bit, that leadership needs to be trusted, and that the qualities that we're taking forward during a crisis, that there are qualities of trust, of decisiveness, of holding truth loosely until we are certain of the facts and what the truth actually is, and that we shouldn't be alone, that there should be a team with recognized responsibilities of who's doing what, who's responding, that it might not be a moment of actually talking to the public as much as releasing something prepared to the public. Larry, is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that is something that you can prepare in advance, Ari, to have a structure in place, know who the team is, identify the primary, secondary spokespersons, kind of the group that you want to immediately get into the war room, and identify, prioritize what needs to be communicated. And so regardless of what the crisis is, the crises are all different, but they all pretty much demand a response that requires honest communication, and particularly when it's a crisis involving a staff person, and there are things that happen in churches all the time. The biggest question is that the media want to know is, what did you know, when did you know it, and what did you do about it? And the sooner you can get on something, get ahead of something, whether it's communicating, and as I mentioned, communicate to your board, communicate to your staff first, privately, then to the congregation, what have you, before you go out public with it. And anything on a media basis needs to be, this is not something you're usually trying to broadcast, although in this case, that's where the corona crisis is so different. But you would want to make sure any media inquiries would be on a per inquiry basis. And what I often suggest with communications officer is let every call go to voicemail, and then you can send the statement to the media person without having to get pulled into an interview. You know, there's an old question that I often like to ask in spokesperson training. I'll ask it to the panel here. When an alligator and a bear have a fight, who wins? Does anybody know?
No.
Well, it depends on where the fight happens. If it happens in water, the alligator is going to win, and if it happens on land, it's the bear. So, if you have to get into a fight over a crisis that regards something spiritual matters that are very common to what you do with a secular reporter, you want to drag that media alligator up on land where you are able to have that conversation along the lines that you can help determine with your statement.
Okay, as we transition into the aftermath for both Nancy and Larry, one thing, do not do this. You've seen it happen. It was the wrong thing to do. Is there advice that you can give people? Do not do this thing.
Nancy,
any big mistakes you've seen?
Yeah, I think what I've often seen is sort of that instant sort of jumping to a reaction. That, you know, somebody says something, or you see a headline that you don't like, and you want to just get out there. Stop. Just stop. And that to take that pause, to have, as Larry was saying, you know, some gates in place to protect you, particularly from media, is just very important. And, you know, there's been times I've almost wrestled the paper out of someone's hands and said, please just sleep on it. Let's talk about it in the morning. So sometimes that urge to quickly respond is best tamped down.
Okay, Sarah's on deck, but Larry, quickly, one thing not to do.
If following up what Nancy said, if you are engaged in a conversation with the media, you can take your cue from Sunday morning talk shows, which many of us don't see because we're in church. But these politicians are amazing.
Yeah.
They don't answer the questions usually. They'll acknowledge the question, but they came to say what they came to say. If they don't, no one's going to say it. So you have to approach any interview as conversation, not confrontation. Even if a reporter was baiting you to try to get you to react to something, acknowledge the question and then go on to say whatever it is you want to make. Again, to self-identify rather than have them pull you into the weeds on an issue or something that's ancillary to what your mission is or what you're all about.
So I'm hearing patience and pick your battlefield and say what you need to say. All right, moving on. Sarah Bartenstein leading us off with the aftermath. Is there anything to do? Or is this job done? Are we all going home? Oh, I think you're still muted, Sarah. Hold on just 1 second.
The first thing you do is you unmute yourself. So after the crisis, I would say, while everything's still fresh in your mind, assess what happened. What did you do well? What could you have done better? Really learn from your successes and your mistakes. Were you slow to respond? Were your messages unclear or contradictory? Were there multiple voices? Who turned out to be the non-anxious presence? And who was overwhelmed or like a deer in the headlights? I would say to look at the assets that you have, from people to infrastructure, and think about how you can be better prepared the next time you have a crisis. What was missing? You might not already have a crisis communication team in place, or you might not have had one before this particular crisis occurred. What did you have to learn how to do on the fly? What can you bake into your more routine communications that might help you when the next when the next crisis comes? Are there relationships with particular media outlets or individual reporters that you realize you might need to tend to or nurture on an ongoing basis? As has already been said, crises come in all shapes and sizes. And so the nature of the crisis will dictate or affect what you do in the aftermath of that crisis. So, for example, if the crisis had to do with abuse or theft, I think it's important to communicate what steps you're taking to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again. Make sure that people—
Sounds like you're saying there can be a crisis within the crisis.
Sure.
Whatever it is that you're reacting to, but you may be blowing it in the midst of it and making a new crisis within it.
Yeah. So you can sort of go back and say, we did not have enough safeguards in place, but this is what we're going to do going forward. We have learned from this experience. I mean, I think it's important for people to know that you learned from the experience, that you're going to act on what you learned. It's really important to be honest and transparent with your members and other audiences about what happened. Not only because it's the right thing to do, but it's going to lay the foundation for trust going forward. So one thing that you'll want to do is to make sure that the messages that you're communicating as you sort of summarize, recapitulate what happened, make sure that you're saying the same things that you said during the crisis, that you're not contradicting yourself. I've actually seen that happen, where in the midst of a crisis, the message was one thing, and afterwards it was something completely different, and it left people thinking, wondering which was the real story. Mm-hmm. Don't wallow in the aftermath, but don't try to rush the healing process or pretend that nothing happened or suggest it wasn't really that bad. And the current crisis is a really good example, and Larry has touched on this. Even though it's not over yet, we can already see that we are never going back to life the way it used to be. It won't always be like it is today. We won't always be sheltering in place, but it's not going to be like it was, back in February. And you have to acknowledge that. People can't heal if we're not open and honest about what's happened and what they have experienced. They won't trust you if they don't think you've leveled with them. And if they don't trust you, then you've taken 50 steps backwards the next time there's a crisis. If you've got a parish newsletter or some similar platform for communication, I'd give some focused attention to how you're going to acknowledge this crisis and describe it, and say something about what life might look like going forward. And do that in a really thoughtful, honest, transparent way. Crises expose pre-existing conditions. Hurricane Katrina made it impossible to ignore the racial and economic inequalities that were present in New Orleans. It made it impossible to ignore that certain decisions about development and the environment had catastrophic consequences. When the Diocese of Virginia had 11 churches break away and try and take their church property with them, one of the things it exposed a lot of things, but one of the things it exposed was a lack of understanding among lay people and even among some clergy about how property is held or owned in the Episcopal Church. And it sounds like sort of like legal minutia, but it's really important for people to understand that. And so the aftermath included a lot of sort of education and re-education of members of the diocese about how property is held in trust for all of us. It's not the personal property of one group of Episcopalians. So the aftermath of the crisis, there were a lot of components to it, but that was one really important one. The pandemic is exposing our dependence on low-wage workers, as well as the real-life consequences of people who have to come to work sick because they don't have paid sick leave. It's exposing what happens when people don't have reliable health care or reliable childcare. So, in the aftermath of a crisis, I think it's important that we not rush going back to normal. We should really talk about what we've learned and help people take that on board.
It almost sounds like part of that patience that has popped up in conversation a few times is determining what the new baseline of normal should be. Yeah,
exactly. And as Larry has said, this is a huge opportunity. And if we can think of the aftermath of a crisis in terms of opportunity instead of, wow, I'm glad that's over, then there's potential for some growth and healing and progress.
Nancy, what are your thoughts on this? Oh, I think you're muted.
So like Sarah, the first thing you do is unmute. But, Sarah really touched on many of the things that, I wanted to offer as we enter into this new normal, because as others have said, you don't come out into this in the same place that you went into a crisis. And so what are the opportunities that are present? And others again have touched on, we're seeing online attendance at churches. I'm following online online giving? Is that, what's happening? So where are the things that we didn't think we could possibly do that we're doing that now may become more mainstream as we go forward? And at the same time, to also look at what are some of the things that maybe it's time to shed, that perhaps, coming out of this, something that seemed so important before perhaps is not as important. So really looking at both the opportunities and what we can let go of. Again, I think the consistency of messaging, I think we're fortunate in the Episcopal Church where we've for several years now been following Jesus and following the way of love as a rule of life. That's been central to our messaging. As we're talking today, we're getting ready as the Episcopal Church to transition into what's the messaging for the next step. And again, it's built around love God, love your neighbor, stay home, which is a little bit oversimplifying, but it's actually very accurate. Make good choices. And grounding all of that in our Book of Common Prayer, that here's this common thread for all of us in the church. How can we look to that resource, which we are using very much in a lot of our live stream worshiping, in our encouraging people to do that at home. As we enter into this next phase, we're also lifting up again the Book of Common Prayer and prayer in general for our church. I think this is also an opportunity for us to look at, what are our values and what are the different ways we can be really helping all of the people who are really hurting at this time. And there's many ways to do that. One of the ways that the Episcopal Church has built in is through the Office of Government Relations and Advocacy. And so as we look at issues about low-wage workers and access to quality health care, access to sick leave, child care, all of those things, looking at not only what we individually can do as individuals or as churches, but as gathered together with people from across the United States, how might we advocate for some real change at the governmental level? And yeah, I think I think I'll leave it at that. That, again, just asking, what can I do as a person? What might I do as a member of, for me, it's St. Michael's Episcopal Church in Marblehead? What might I be able to do as a citizen in my state and in my country? And really looking for both opportunities and perhaps things that need to be let go of or changed.
Hey, Steve, this is Larry.
Yes.
Both Sarah and Nancy have said. Can I add something to what both Sarah and Nancy have said?
Absolutely.
As far as what Sarah was talking about in communicating, I think it's important to, as we look at audiences, determine who needs to know. Obviously, internal audiences for sure, but then also evaluating who must respond. And these would be activists, or these would be the naysayers, or whomever may be trained, whatever your position is. You know they're going to be making comment. And then who will or who can respond, and these would be your allies if it's better for others to speak on your behalf. Also, I think it's important, we've talked more about the traditional legacy media so far, but don't forget, we're in this brave new world of digital and social media. I think the first thing that churches can do prior to any crisis is to evaluate their social media guidelines for employees. The last thing you need is for employees, whether it's volunteers or staff, to be popping off on social media out of ignorance. So we need to make sure those are well placed. And then secondly, that incorporate social media into your plan. And then I think too, it's also important as people come to your website seeking information that we determine when, sometimes it's not always advisable, if and when we need to post an FAQ with some additional information, factual information, perhaps after the initial crush of media focus or whatever, it helps people understand what's really going on. This opportunity that Nancy referenced, I think that as we come out of we flatten the curve, come out of back into church, I think it's important to not let your innovation come to a stop. Churches have been setting up online services and figuring out how to go on YouTube and shooting more personal video. Don't forget the power of the personal testimony. You could take an iPhone and get someone's testimony of a life change as a result of what you're doing, be it an outreach for food or shelter or just spiritual advice. But also, I think opportunity to connect to the community, and the virus has opened a wide door for churches to connect with their community and shed some light. Also, it was mentioned earlier, providing online prayer. A lot of churches are launching prayer lines on Facebook. That's a life support to many people. They're looking for hope and a way to love each other. But I think also connection may be even more important. People are looking for connection, and this pandemic has changed the way we do business. Also, if you haven't already, 75% of churches were not prepared for an online service. And many are scrambled to get online. It's an important thing. It's the wave of the future.
I'm surprised it was only 75%.
Yeah, well, it's in the polls that I've seen. But the internet is the venue. Anyone you're trying to reach, it's where they exist. And yet, what's happening is I think church online will become the front door and the side door. We've always looked at it as a back door for people who are lazy or don't want to come to church or whatever. But now it's going to be a front door for new people, tire kickers, if you will, and a side door for believers or faithful who perhaps can't get out of their home or travel or whatever. But I think that we have to be careful that we don't make it a consumer church. We're not talking about going back to the days of the consumer church, but it's remain missional. And then Nancy, you mentioned online giving. That's important as well. There's many services to do that as you empower your members.
I want to quickly, I'm gonna call an audible, and there's a question that I'm gonna ask the entire panel. But first, I want to recap where we've been. Ari was talking about people and processes, that it's about trust, that it is about it being a business problem to actually determine what you're talking about, that there are predictable things, there are unpredictable things, and that if you have the right people sitting at the table, you have the right processes in place, then it gives you the ability to do what you can anticipate and the thing that lands on your head. Because there's not one solution that covers everything. Ari, would you say that's correct?
Yeah, I would absolutely say, that's, correct. The piece that I would add to what others have been saying is to really be intentional about the messaging. Whether you're talking on social media, whether you're talking to a reporter, whether you're sending an email, to really know the message that you're getting across. And that, if you are talking to a reporter, one of the key pieces of advice I always give in this situation is that the reporter is neither your friend nor your therapist. That this is not a time that, you're in the middle of a crisis and finally somebody's willing to hear your story, to just say everything that is possibly on your head, because they will report it all. I was in a situation a few years back where a client, as Larry said, sometimes better to issue a statement than get on the phone with a reporter. A client insisted on getting on the phone with the reporter to maintain the good relationship they had with that reporter, and turn what would have likely been a very short 2-paragraph brief into a front-page story in the Washington Post. That only just exploded the crisis beyond imaginability. The advice is always, stay on message, get across what you want to get across. Don't go further unless it's helpful for you to do so. Again, as Larry talked about, those grays as opposed to the black and white, that can be, really, really helpful in these situations.
Absolutely. During the crisis, we talked about, again, leadership needing to be trusted, that it is about courage, it is about trust, it's about decisiveness, it is about holding the truth loosely until you are certain of the facts and know what the truth actually is. And the theme that I heard pop up again and again and again through all three stages, patience. Patience is the antidote for adrenaline. When you are hit with something that you are not sure what to do, adrenaline is going to spike because we are human and because we have that fight or flight instinct. Everybody is talking about the patience of a seasoned person to stop, take a beat, see what's actually going on. And in the aftermath, one of the most important things that I heard out of many, assess and debrief. What happened? What worked? What didn't work? One of the interesting points that Sarah made that I actually had not thought about before is it's a good opportunity to see who on the team is up for the task. And that is a terribly not churchy thing to talk about. But if we are stewards of the work and the thing God has given us, doing it to the best of our abilities and maintaining those points of excellence across the board also is incumbent upon all of us. It was about accelerating and assessing the learning curve that happened as a result of the crises. It was being transparent with the audience. It was being patient again through recovering from it, not to wallow in the trauma of what happened, but not to deny that it happened. It was to be also very cohesive in our messaging. If the story was this during the crisis, it needs to be this after the crisis, so you don't provide confusion to people. Now, here is the audible. And before I do it, because this is gonna be our closing thing, I want to first of all thank everybody that attended today. We're so excited that you joined us for this. It is obvious this is a massive, massive conversation. I'm going to be trying to extend it with our panelists to get more information for you that I can hopefully work with Joe to get to you. But I also want to thank the panelists themselves. Nancy, Sarah, Ari, Larry, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and to lend your very seasoned voice and perspectives to something I think I need to get better at. We all need to raise our game and get better at. I'm a firm believer that life is a classroom and that we should always be learning, and I am learning today. So here is my audible, because COVID-19 will hit the rearview mirror soon enough. What responsibility do we have to help people get over it? And what might that look like? Do we leave that to therapists? As communicators, do we play a role in the healing phase of the trauma produced by a crisis? Open floor as we close.
So I'll take a shot at this one. I think, my work, throughout the faith community, I've always believed that there's a really important role that the faith community plays in situations, that we find ourselves in right now. That, while we look to government for policy solutions, there's also the parts of the solution that require cultural change and guidance that isn't about what the law is or what the directive is from our elected officials, but it's how we bring people together, in community, to find these solutions. And so, I think, I myself am Jewish. I see that in my own community. I've seen that in the work that I've done, at the National Cathedral and other faith communities. I think there is that common element of how, faith communities can provide that cultural change and how we communicate that and how we, take advantage of these opportunities. In terms of this specific crisis, Rahm Emanuel has, the line, never let a good crisis go to waste. And so, that, very much is true here. So we find ourselves in a worldwide crisis, but how do we use, this opportunity to create what's next?
Anyone else? Nancy.
Yes. So, I think in speaking specifically as people of faith in communities of faith, I think, what we're seeing is, once again, the church is us. The church isn't the buildings. And I think in many ways we're strengthening relationships through this. I'm hearing about people reaching out through old-fashioned phone trees, connecting with each other in many ways, that this may be a time where some of our relationships are strengthening. And as we're able to gather together, we may be praying together. We're certainly going to be weeping together for all that's been lost, particularly the loved ones who've been lost. But also to coming together to laugh again and to see how we can make a difference in our world. And so I think those relationships will really be part of the healing process for many.
Steve, go ahead, Sarah.
Sarah.
One of the things that has struck me about this particular crisis on a daily basis is how clearly it illustrates our interconnectedness, and as nothing else could have. And so I think if we don't remind people of that, that we are learning that from this crisis, then we're not being the church, because that's what the church is. It's being interconnected.
Absolutely. Larry.
Well, I think in the crisis, we're still in it. I think the crisis is all about making decisions and communicating well. And during the crisis, we need to be ice in the belly, but warmth in the heart. And as we come out, I think our communication needs to be focused on being authentic, transparent, honest, and pastoral. I think the church, there's so much it's political. You watch briefings and all, it's all political. People just don't know what's going on or what. But I think we can be pastoral in answering these questions of the heart. People are desperately searching. I heard a missionary from our church yesterday report on our online service. He's in Iran, and he said that they have a hotline for people. They're not calling for food or for clothing. They're calling to ask, how can I have a relationship with Jesus? People are hurting, and they want some answers to the bigger questions of life. This is not new. I was reading a book by C.S. Lewis recently, the author, who about coming out of his own crisis, World War II, and how his priorities had changed. He thought how easy it was for him to be focused on some little pleasure of a book or a friend or brandy somewhere, and that now his only treasure is Christ, and he's realized by God's grace what really is important. But he hoped that as they came out of the world, he wouldn't in several weeks back to the same old banality of living. So I think we can help stay focused on the main thing, if you will. And staff engagement, I think, is important. We should over-communicate with staff. And that I think that we will adjust our priorities based on what's happening in our region and our neighborhood or the opportunity that we have. But meanwhile, I would just say this, as we continue to shelter in place, I just say we love like Jesus and wash our hands like Pontius Pilate.
All right. So I'm hearing a whole lot of the way of love as we talk about recovering from COVID-19. We've been talking about crisis communications, what we do before, what we do during, what we do afterwards. And I'm so thankful for our panelists today. Next up with the SEEP Network is going to be Reface Inequity and COVID-19 with Christchurch Cranbrook and New York Times columnist Charles Blau. Learn more about that on the website seepnetwork.org. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Steve Haal, and y'all have a great day.
Thank you, Steve.
Wash his hands. Thank you, everybody.
Good job.
Have a great day.